We are now on to our dodge tool, burn tool, and sponge tool. Now, the words dodge might not make much sense to the average person if you have not yet done photography where you've actually processed negatives and film. So I won't go through a fancy explanation of dodging and burning, but I just went to Wikipedia because I knew they'd have some image here. So basically you have an enlarger and it's pushing light onto your photo paper with your image getting shown through from your negative. And burning in means you're allowing more light onto an area. So if you need an area darker, then you put more light. And what that means typically is that you have a piece of paper that is cut. Might be, old school time, if you had a house that you wanted to make darker, you'd actually cut out the shape of a house. And then you basically just kind of shift this piece of paper or barrier a little bit so that you don't get too hard of an edge. But that way, basically, your rest of your image is, normal, but if whatever area you want darker, you just go ahead and do that. On the alternate side is dodging, and that's where you actually cover the light source. And typically it's these little circle paddles with handle on it, and you basically you keep the light from going onto your photo paper. So that lightens an area and these darken. So burning and dodging, those terms are from darkroom photography. So I use both probably pretty much equally. I'll go ahead and keep using this image, but I can say for the most part I use dodging and burning on people's eyes for the most part. I lighten up the white, and sometimes if it's a close-up of the eyes, I will also lighten and also darken the pupils, or not the pupils, but the iris, excuse me. So dodging, this one doesn't need a lot of light, right, because it's a pretty light image to start with, but I'll go ahead and show it to you. And again, this is about size of brush and hardness of brush. In addition to this one, you need to know what area you're trying to do this to. Is it the highlights, the midtones, or shadows? So highlights would be like this lightest part here, and you can see my exposure is so strong that it just blows it out right away. So to do something more subtle, you'd have to, be a bit quieter about it. The midtones will probably pick up a little bit of that gray, and then the shadows will pick up the darkest areas, or try to pick up the darkest areas. And then the burn tool does the opposite, it darkens. And so lighten, again, highlights, I don't think it does much good. It basically just adds a layer of gray. Midtones, though, it does help if you need them to be a little bit darker. And most certainly, I tend to burn in shadows the most, just because, it always adds a higher level of contrast when I need it. And in particular, this butterfly, I think those dark areas could certainly use it. And I'm being a bit rough. Typically, I wouldn't want to do the plants around it. But let me just turn it on and off. So you can see I did some work to it. That ugliness right there too. And so in this instance, I think it certainly helped the image. It popped that butterfly a little bit more towards the camera, towards the viewer. And so those are those ones. And then finally the sponge tool. Its job is to saturate or desaturate. So I use it, but not as often as the other two. Again, I'll focus over here. This might be a situation where saturation makes more sense, but I'll give I'll also do the desaturate. So this one, you can click vibrance. It'll try to keep a little bit more intense, though I don't honestly notice a ton of difference. Usually depends on your hue. Saturate flow, again, you might want to have a little bit lower to start with instead of blasting it, and then again, depending on what you're trying to saturate, you might need to change your setting just a little bit. So on this one, you can add a little bit more color, not too intensely, but just a little bit more. So if I turn this off, you can see how much of a difference that really did make. On the alternate side, if I go to desaturate, let's see, spot we can desaturate. I'll just do a flower here. So if I, again, depending on flow and all that stuff, you can actually take this down quite far. I'll go ahead and bump up the flow a lot so it does its job faster. But basically, I can almost take the purple out. It'll just desaturate it down to a point where it becomes gray. So if there's something distracting or, you know, anything like that, you can certainly desaturate. So if you see the difference between those two, it's pretty stark. So desaturation and saturation can be used in really spot areas. There are other tools if you want overall saturation or desaturation to an entire image, but this is the tool to use when you need it and just in little spots.